Have you ever noticed that gap between what we understand about our lives and how we actually live them? We often can find ourselves moving through the world as if we are a personality that just happens to have a body. But what happens when we stop resisting the situation we find ourselves in and instead meet it with a bit of wonder? I'm Christiane Piano, and this is YourReset Reflections, a space for the unfiltered reality of being human. This isn't about finding a magic formula or a distraction. It's an invitation to a different kind of attention. Over the last 2 years, this expression has evolved into a place where we discuss the things most people don't, the challenging parts, the joyful parts, and the quiet rigor of unlearning the patterns that keep us stuck. Whether you're here for the first time or returning to these layers again, I invite you to just sit back, listen, reflect, and see what opens up when we finally move toward wholeness. I'm so glad you're here. Let's begin. Hello, I am Christiane Piano. Welcome to episode 107. This is the first one being released after what feels like quite a long pause. It's been a while since we last sat together in this way, and whether you were returning or joining me for the first time, I'm so glad you're here for what feels like a brand new beginning. For a long time, this podcast moved with a very specific, reliable cadence, a rhythm I held with a deep sense of commitment, and that was the appropriate pace for quite a stretch of time. But gradually, I started to notice a quiet, constant knock at the door, a nudge, if you will, that simply refused to be ignored. To be honest, I sensed I was hesitating to listen to the knock. Have you ever experienced that for yourself? I liken it to life trying to get your attention. It quietly knocks in the beginning, but if it answered, the knocking gets louder. Can you relate to what I'm speaking to? Perhaps it's something that is unfolding presently in your life, or maybe it is a point of reference that pops into mind from your past. Whatever it may be, have you ever become curious as to why you are not answering? I sense right now that one of the reasons I was not responding was simply because of the integrity of that promise I made to deliver a new Reflections podcast every Monday at the same time. And because I hold my commitment so deeply, I felt a real fear of what might happen if I let a rhythm drop that I had spent so much energy manifesting. I was not quite sure how the people like yourself who listen to this podcast would respond. And for sure, I was not clear on how to allow the cadence to change without feeling like I was losing the thread of the commitment itself. Finally, answering that knock took a specific kind of courage. It required the permission to simply let the rhythm drop so I could step into the silence and see what this new spaciousness had to reveal. In answering that knock, a new space opened up, not just for me, but for this entire expression. It led me to an unexpected level of unlearning that I didn't even know I needed. I have been reminded at an even deeper layer of what I have already come to discover, and it is simply this. We aren't vessels to be filled or boxes to be organized. We are living, breathing, and expanding expressions of life. So although as of late the output of new episodes has been quiet, there has been an incredible amount of fertile work going on in that silence. And with that said, I am so happy to be back with you today to share what has been growing there. As some of you may know, these episodes are always inspired by the raw material of my own life, woven together with what is unfolding in the world around us. To describe the complexity of the global landscape right now is a challenge, and while that isn't the central focus of today's reflection, it is an essential backdrop. We can so easily forget that the frequency of what is happening globally has a direct impact on our body-mind well-being. And it is fundamental that we remember this, as how we care for ourselves and how that informs our care for our loved ones is directly related. I am including this reminder because not only are these episodes a resonance of the collective, they are also inspired by the raw and real conversations I'm having, whether in a professional setting or a personal one, with human beings like yourself. And there are new patterns forming and new layers and levels of awakening. With that, another layer and level of commitment is needed for me to show up for the ever-increasing, courageous requests for more support. So many of you are beginning to give yourselves permission to lean in and receive. To give oneself permission to receive this requires something fundamental, the creation of space and time. And this is one of the patterns I'm beginning to see. What has been surfacing most vividly is a visceral need for space and time. So that is the inquiry we are stepping into today. We are going to explore the expression breathing room. So what is breathing room exactly? Let's just sit with those words for a beat. Breathing room. As you do, does any area of your life, a person, or a situation immediately come to mind that you sense could benefit from a bit more space? Shortly before I recorded episode 106 with Alessandro, I began exploring the idea of breathing room. In the week since, while listening back to our conversation, one specific thought he shared kept pulling at me. I didn't see the connection then, but sitting here now, the clarity has finally arrived. What he said was this: if you want something good, you can have it now. But if you want the best, you have to wait. You have to give it the time it actually requires. And as I sat with those words, I realized he wasn't just talking about patience. He was talking about the state of our being while we navigate the time required for something of quality to be born. And in that, a new realization landed that for me, the time had actually arrived to allow this particular expression to evolve. Whether it is in relationship to ourselves, others, or our creations, there comes a moment where we must give ourselves radical permission to create the space where that evolution can actually happen. But honoring that space is rarely as peaceful as it sounds. Answering that knock has been a visceral process, a tug and pull within me for weeks. It took every bit of that time to find the words for this one episode, not because they were missing, but because I had to wait for the silence to finish its work within me. There is a specific rhythm to how these episodes come into being. It starts with a pop-through idea, a spark that stays with me, sometimes for a long time, as I chew on it and sense if it is truly supportive and relevant for you. Once I feel a green light, I toy with the ideas, feeling into them in my body before slowly bringing them into a cohesive order. This is a layered process. It requires days, sometimes weeks of writing, pausing, and editing, returning to the silence again and again until the words finally land. And I don't mean landing in perfection. If I waited for that, no episode would ever be released. It's simply a place where I feel comfortable offering this version to the world. But you see, as this expression has grown, so has its complexity. The layers have deepened, and the time required to honor that depth has grown exponentially. And I've realized that this work needs its own space to breathe. It cannot be rushed or squeezed into a tight window without losing its essence. I began to sense a friction. The work was calling for more space, but the weekly cadence was growing tighter. I knew then that something had to shift. And so I chose to stay. I decided to honor the time it actually took to inhabit that space without the pressure of a deadline. Throughout these weeks, my thoughts have turned to you quite often. After 2 years of our steady rhythm, I've been curious about what this pause has opened up for you. What have you been discovering? Which earlier conversations have you found yourself returning to in the quiet? The messages I've received from some of you during this time have stayed with me. They've deepened my sense of how much we are all navigating together. So let's take a moment to land this. Beyond the mental scan of your life or your schedule, I invite you to find this inquiry in your body. Feel into it. Pause for a moment to consider. When you think of breathing room, where do you actually feel that space or the total lack of it within yourself? If you scan your life right now, where do you sense the need for a little more room to move? Lately, I've been leaning into that very inquiry myself, allowing myself to drop out of the mind and into the visceral lived experience of space and time. In that search, I looked at the literal clinical definitions of breathing room to see if they matched what I was discovering in that depth, but they didn't. There was a friction between the experience and the language available. What I uncovered was a vocabulary that felt purely clinical. It's often described as a period of rest to increase strength or physical room to move comfortably. But as I sat with those definitions, their thinness was startling. They touch the logistics of space, but they don't even come close to the hunger for it. They treat us like a machine that needs a pause to perform better, rather than a being that needs a place to be. I've been considering that maybe breathing room isn't just a break so we can go back and work harder. And I wonder about the way we hold our rest. Do we treat it as a way to recharge the battery only to drain it again the moment we return? Is our pause simply a tool to fuel the next sprint? Or is there something deeper we are actually starving for? What if breathing room isn't just a pause in doing so we can do more? What if it's a shift in being, a fundamental change in how we inhabit our lives? It feels like a visceral craving for relief, a relief from the pressure to constantly act, to think, or to produce. It's that moment, the one I imagine you have felt from time to time, where the urgency finally drops away and you can actually hear your own pulse again. There is a sense of suspension from the built-up pressure where freedom and spaciousness magnify. It may be for a blip or an extended stretch, but when it arrives, it's palpable. In that moment of zooming in and out, a revelation surfaced that shifted everything. I saw how the beginning of a new expression could be likened to the arrival of a newborn. When an infant enters your life, it is an absolute life-changing pivot. Nothing will ever be like it was before, and the level of care required is full on. But as that baby grows, the level of care is meant to change naturally. It evolves. I realized I had been holding on to a way of being, a level of intensity that belonged to the infancy of this work. But we are standing in a different place today, and I needed to allow the space for that relationship to naturally change. I invite you to pause for a moment and reflect on the dynamics associated with the initial stage of a life, that period where there is no separation between the caregiver and the child. It is a time of total immersion. A new life often requires that intense, constant nursing, if you will. It needs you to survive. And at the beginning of a life, that would be appropriate. It is a beautiful yet challenging state where the project, the dream, or the expression relies entirely on your presence to exist. In those early days, that level of consistent presence isn't just a habit, it's a requirement. But as the life expression grows, the relationship will require a shift. Now, when speaking about a creative expression of some kind, if it's truly alive, it will naturally grow and change. And to allow for a flourishing relationship, it proves supportive if we are willing to grow and change with it. Because if we don't, we risk stifling it. I realized that if I keep holding this podcast with that same newborn urgency, I'm not actually helping it grow. I'm crowding it. That is the point where the breathing room I was craving finally made sense. It wasn't about maintenance or recovery. It was about the visceral necessity of getting myself out of the way so that the urgency could drop away and the work could finally find its own breath. I'm wondering, do you have something in your life that started as a newborn, literally or figuratively, maybe a project, a relationship, or a dream that has grown, but you're still holding it with that original breathless intensity? What would it feel like to give that thing the room it actually requires to breathe now? For me, asking that question was the beginning of a profound shift. It was the moment I stopped looking at the output and started looking at the ecology. In that space, I began to see not only the life of this work, but the ecology of the whole that this work is a part of in a new way. There is a threshold where the relationship moves from that constant, intimate nursing toward a different expression of that same connection. It is a moment of trust, not a withdrawal of presence, but a shift in its nature. It's the trust that the work has enough life in it to hold its own space for a moment, which in turn allows me the room to tend to the roots of the whole tree. I had to look at why it felt so difficult to step back. I had a lingering fear. Can this expression stand on its own if I'm not constantly hovering? Our relationship to our work or to a child or a partner is always a mirror. We see this so clearly in parenting. A parent can be so overpresent that they leave no room for the child to realize how capable they actually are. That overprotection is often a reflection of our own inability to trust the child, the work, to exist without our constant presence. Giving this expression breathing room was about acknowledging that it is now strong enough to breathe on its own, allowing me to witness how it belongs to the larger ecology of my life. I saw that mirror in myself. I had been staying in the weekly rhythm of this expression not out of a habit, but out of fidelity. I stayed in that cadence because I had made a commitment to you, and for a long time, that intense one-on-one focus was exactly what this work required in its infancy. But as this expression matured and became more layered, the energy it demanded began to grow. I had to be realistic. I have an entire tree to tend to, other branches, other children, and the practical realities of life that sustain me. By staying so tightly wound to weekly output, I was crowding out the very things that allow the tree to stand. The only thing standing between that old rhythm and the attention the rest of the tree needed was permission. It wasn't about a new plan. It was the internal authority to finally say, I'm allowed to step away from the weekly cadence to be with this knocking. And giving myself that permission was an act of self-care and a moment of trusting my intuition, even when I couldn't put my finger on what I was waiting for. It was a visceral felt experience of allowing the work to stand on its own so I could be reminded of the larger ecology it belongs to. And as it turns out, that permission was the only thing I actually needed to allow a new clarity to surface. A new cadence is now necessary and appropriate to match the growth of this expression. This breathing room has been a gift of pure spaciousness. It challenged me to trust at a different level, not to manage a fear, but to simply allow myself to breathe and be. In that wide open space, I watched the world literally blossoming all around me. I don't think I have ever seen so many trees blooming at once. Yet the humbling revelation was that they were all opening in their own specific time. Nature doesn't have a production schedule, it has a season. In this spaciousness, I gave myself permission to go for walks, longer walks, whenever they were needed. It was on one of these walks that I met a new friend named Aldo. Aldo is in his late 80s, a piece of old growth wisdom walking the neighborhood. He isn't performing, he is just existing in his own season. He is a man who has weathered many winters of pain and loss, and yet he carries an unbeaten spirit and a high vibration. In a world that often asks us to be personalities dragging bodies around, Aldo is simply rooted. Being in his presence, I've found that each simple exchange leaves me feeling recharged and revitalized. It's a stark contrast to the draining noise of the world outside of his gate. For a while, we kept a neighborly distance, me on the pavement of the street, he on the other side of his garden fence. But recently, that boundary dissolved. The conversation shifted from casual pleasantries to an invitation into his inner sanctum. Stepping off the concrete and into his garden was such an honor. To be invited into someone's personal space is always so humbling. He began to share the stories woven into his land, tales of his life, his losses, his joys, and the seasons he has weathered. And as he spoke, he reached into the earth. He offered me vegetables and herbs, as if he were sharing his own vitality. And there we were, kneeling on his land, digging up herbs and chicory, talking about the things that actually matter. And there was a simple human connection, no matter the age difference, the cultural differences, and whatever could have possibly seemed to get in the way. We were just two human beings sharing in life together. And after he gathered and gifted me the fruits of his labor, he began to show me the rest of his property. Imagine this garden filled with fruit trees and palm trees, and as you look out and around, see the towering mountains covered in snow and the hills and valleys of vineyards. It takes my breath away every single time. And as we meandered through this beauty, he looked at me and asked if he could gift me a tree. I was floored, like mouth wide open and speechless. I was simply deeply touched by his generosity, by the sheer beauty that reveals itself when there's breathing room. In that moment, there were no words and there was no lesson. There was just the weight of being there, standing in the middle of all that blooming life, receiving a gift I hadn't even known to ask for. It wasn't until later, reflecting on our time together and the sequence of these past weeks, that I realized that there was and is a theme here. A theme about trees. I began to see that this wasn't just a nice story about a neighbor. It was an invitation into a different way of being in the world. Aldo's garden didn't just happen. It is the result of decades of stewardship, of tending the roots and honoring the seasons. The blossoming isn't passive. It happens because the ecology is right. This realization changed the way I looked at everything, and it led me to stop treating the branches of my life like newborns that needed constant nursing, and to start honoring my life as an ecology to be tended. Because when the roots are nourished and the trunk is strong, the bloom is the natural, inevitable overflow of that health. This framework of the tree was being revealed to me through the patterns appearing everywhere in my life, in my walks, my conversations, and even in the silence of this inquiry. In every culture, the tree represents the bridge between the hidden and the seen. It is a map of how life actually works. I invite you to look at this tree with me, not just as a metaphor of my work, but as a mirror for your own life. And the reason I invite you to move through this with me is because quite often, when we understand the anatomy of our own tree, we interrupt the tendency to attempt a forcing of the bloom and start tending the source. Okay, so here we go. Let's take a look at the ecology of the sprawling tree, the roots. This is my foundational nourishment. The silence, the mat, the longer walks. that protect my frequency and the literal food I nourish myself with. This is the quiet soil we all need to stand in so that we don't wither under the pressure of the world, whether they come from within or without. The trunk, the inner spine. This is my being, the central pillar of my maturation. Just as prana or life energy flows through my spine, there is a lymph, a life force, that moves within my trunk. This is where the necessity for resetting and coming back to center lives. If I allow this central pillar to become compressed, my life force cannot flow to the rest of the ecology. My work is about ensuring that this central pillar remains fluid and open, so the life force can reach every leaf. The branches. When I zoom out, I see the sheer abundance of this sprawling tree. There are the many arms I am called to tend. The podcast, the one-to-one body mind maturation work, my privates, the video on demand service, YourReset Getaway, the Reflections Club, the Body Mind series, the brand new In the Kitchen expression, and the live and in-person special events. Then there's the sap. This is my vitality. I realize that if I flood the podcast branch with the majority of the sap, my ecology becomes lopsided, and these other beautiful expressions don't receive the vitality they need to thrive as well. The oxygen. This is the ultimate realization. Oxygen isn't something I get from the outside. It is a capacity I create through proper circulation. When the sap reaches every leaf, the tree can finally perform its own version of photosynthesis. It can exchange with the world. Breathing room is the restoration of this internal circulation. It is the environment where the pressure drops away, allowing the entire ecology to finally find its own frequency. In this spaciousness, the bloom becomes the natural, inevitable overflow of the tree's health. As I spend time doing the dance of zooming in and out and being in reflection in the spaciousness and the suspension of time that opened up during this breathing room exploration, the evidence that answering the knock was necessary presented itself. My roots, my silence, my time in nature, my radical self-care are what provide the sap for everything else. If I am not standing in that quiet soil, the branches of my life, the podcast, my one-to-one work, my new kitchen series, etc., will eventually wither. That afternoon in the garden with Aldo reminded me that if the roots aren't tended, the tree cannot stand. It is from this grounded stability that the sheer abundance of the tree is actually sustained. In fact, it was this very shift in my own rhythm, this commitment to breathing room, that allowed the in the kitchen expression to finally have the sap it needed to bloom. I can see now that by letting go of the old urgency, I created the space for that new branch to truly thrive. Okay, so now we come to the active participation that will require you to sit and reflect and apply to your own life. I suggest creating time and space for this. Begin simply with reflecting on the following. Begin to explore and look at your own tree, not as a metaphor, but as a mirror. If you scan your own roots, your own inner spine, and the branches of your life, where is the sap being flooded? And where is the atmosphere so thick with urgency that you can no longer hear your own pulse? What would change if you gave yourself the oxygen of suspension? And I sense that this is the perfect place to bring this reflection to a close. Take your time in listening and re-listening to the multi-layered levels of exploration that are possible. Create breathing room and move back in, and when you feel ready, sit down and attempt to visually map out your tree. You are a living, breathing expression of life. May you never forget that. I look forward to hearing from you about what resonated in this episode and what you are discovering, learning, and unlearning. share, like, follow, pass it on to someone that you know that you think this would be supportive of, and listen in as often as you need. Until next time, this has been Your Reset Reflections with Christiane Piano. If you are interested in working with me on any level of body-mind well-being, whether it be through individual body-mind maturation work sessions, perhaps participating in a series, individual privates, or through my video on-demand services, if you have questions, if you would like to engage on any level, feel free to schedule a free 15-minute consult in the appointment section, www.christianepiano.com, or email me directly at growth@christianepiano.com.